The legend of the Cakkavatti, or wheel-turning monarch. This legend offers a very profound lesson on the heights of human potential. According to the suttas, a human being is born with the 32 marks of a great man, the Mahapurisa, but this is only at incredibly rare intervals. This is a true human being, a Buddha, or someone who has the potential, a great potential to become a Buddha. So such an individual is destined for one of two paths. They'll either become a Buddha, a realized Buddha, or a Cakkavatti. And what this is known as in the English translation is a wheel-turning monarch. And it is the secular counterpart to the Buddha. This represents the absolute pinnacle of worldly development, but I believe still with great virtue. So this duality is famously captured in the birth story of the Buddha Gautama. And I think it makes sense that the virtue remains because it's only for virtuous people. Only virtuous people naturally have the 32 marks of a great, what is essentially the Superman. I think it was Heidegger who had that idea, the Uberman and the Superman, of these superhuman potential and qualities. So you're either a virtuous wheel-turning monarch or a Buddha. And so in the story, the birth story of the Buddha, when there was a wise man who observed these marks on the infant prince. And he predicted that this prince would either achieve enlightenment and become a Buddha, a great one of great teaching, or a world conqueror. So his father, as a worldly and ambitious ruler, of course, he had a very keen interest in making his son, promoting his son to become the next world leader. But so what he did was he surrounded the prince with the greatest luxuries of sense pleasure. Because he's born in royalty, so he has the ability to do this. It's already fairly pleasant place to live in, but by maintaining the best foods and dancers and entertainment, luxuries and clothing. So he lived, this prince, the story of the Buddha, he lived an incredible life of luxury and sense pleasure to distract him from spiritual inquiry and tether him to the worldly ambition. But at some point, that strategy failed by the monarch. So the mythology of the Cakkavatti describes a celestial event that marks the rise of this kind of leader. Now, what happened early on, there's this 8-spoked wheel that appears in the sky, and it's usually visible from a very great distance because it's so far away. You can see it from different parts of the world, but it's big enough to see. And people might initially mistake it for a second moon or a strange celestial phenomenon. But eventually this wheel settles over the king's palace, and recognizing it as the Dhammacakka, the wheel of truth. Notice that Pali language is a more simplified version of Sanskrit, essentially. So it's not chakra with the R, it's just chakka. Just like dharma, it's just dhamma. So the king pays obeisance and sprinkles it with water, formally assuming his role in the wheel turning monarch. So he recognizes this, and then they follow. He follows the wheel as it progresses through the sky. In a scene that defies ordinary physics, the king and his army and his entire entourage, including his artisans and civilians, they all rise into the air and float behind the wheel. They follow it. This is very much like a story. This is more believable in happening in the god realm. So this is very mythological because these are human. This is the human level here. They are not supposed to float like this. But they move from kingdom to kingdom, and other rulers emerge with their armies. And seeing the power of the wheel, these kings pay homage. They don't object or start a war. So the Cakkavatti does not use violence. Instead, he admonishes them to keep the moral precepts and rule justly. So he conquers the entire earth without stick or rod or sword, achieving a peaceful unification. That's how he unifies the world system. The Cakkavati's reach extends beyond their own realm, Jambudipa, the physical world or the earth, and goes on to the three other islands or vast cosmic continents in the world system surrounding the central mountain, the Mount Meru. And while these are described as islands, they almost function like other planets or dimensions because they're so far away that they may not even be physical. And they certainly aren't, but there might be a physical aspect to them, but they're too far away. They can't, as I described in the previous lecture on in the northern continent, you can't reach any of these continents or places. If it's a far off island in the world system, you reach them through psychic means, not through physical means, because these are different dimensions. So the description of this wheel has led to a lot of modern speculation, because in certain commentaries, the wheel is described in a very minute, almost technical detail, almost mechanical, as well as the monarch himself. He's like this, almost like a steam engine or steampunk worker and king. He has to manage this great thing. The texts describe metal tubes and intricate parts, mechanical pieces. But I mean, I get the idea in my head, like in the movie Spirited Away, where there's that big, the giant spider man, that wise old man with the spider body, and he's just constantly cranking this shaft to make the fire go, but it's like a wheel instead as a monarch. So that's kind of the imagery that it has. But we won't decipher too much on the mechanical aspect or the physics of this, whether it suggests a visitor from another dimension or an advanced, or the possibility of its extraterrestrials, or hinting at extraterrestrial visits or advanced technology from other races, right? Ancient descriptions are strikingly mechanical. Now, the nature of the Cakkavatti, that wheel, is as mysterious as it is unique, because unlike later science fiction or modern mythology, the scriptures never mention any beings living inside or operating it. Nothing like that. It does sound like it could be, a spinning UFO or something. So it appears to be sentient, though, by itself and semi-autonomous as an entity into itself. And some people speculate that it represents the sun, that maybe it was actually just the sun moving across the sky. But the way they describe it, I think it's just too strange for the ancients to write about the sun or the moon as some really unfamiliar, unknown, indescribable object that they've never seen before moving across the sky. I don't think it's that. I don't think they're referring to the sun or the moon. So instead, it's a physical representation. It's probably a symbol for charisma and moral authority of the world-turning emperor and the universality of this omnipotence of him. So it also represents a purely peaceful charisma that inspires global federation rather than that stark contrast of what we've had in with previous historical world rulers. It's someone to rejoice in. It's not someone to fear. For example, Queen Victoria's British Empire was so vast, the sun never set on it. And that dominion was built, however, with the rod and the sword. There was violence, there were strict rules, there were wars and fights. The guards were armed with swords, and they were very dangerous. So the Buddhist ideal, however, is a conquest of the heart, where other nations are willing to join in. There's no fear surrounding the leader, and it's based on the monarch's virtue that they want to be a part of this. That's the basis. Yet the Buddhist scriptures maintain an ambivalent attitude towards kingship, because in one sutta, the Buddha contemplates whether it's even truly possible to rule justly without force. And at that moment, Mara appears and tries to tempt him, and he says, "You have the power. Why don't you turn the Himalayan mountains into gold and benefit all beings and make yourself king of the world?" But the Buddha simply dismissed Mara because he saw through these, worldly and sensual temptations that Mara always provides. Because the Buddha is prudent. He knows that the fundamental question remains: is it possible to rule without rod and sword? And even if you were a king with gold and things like that, that would just lead to temptation anyway. That can reverse his Buddhahood over time. And so on an ordinary worldly plane, this ideal has rarely been met. The monarchs of the Buddha's time were practical and often brutal. They used war and very harsh punishments to maintain order. But however, we can see modern history, I would say, gradually making its way toward this ancient aspiration, or at least, I think, accidentally. In certain ways, we're definitely becoming more civilized, removing, capital punishment, for example, and removing things like the death penalty. But with capital punishment, there's the idea that a state ruling without this death penalty, and that came about, in Canada, that was 1968 when we finally lifted that, and various Scandinavian countries as well around that time, I guess. Nonviolence, with regarding to nonviolence, some nations have been even moved away from maintaining standing armies. So this kind of echoes the Buddhist vision of nonviolence, which was written thousands of years ago. And the financial structure of the Cakkavatti's regime is just it's just as idealized as his pacifism, because taxation is considered undesirable. So the monarch's wealth comes from a miraculous source instead. As the king follows so what they do in the scriptures, the king follows the wheel through the sky, and then it plunges into the ocean, and the waters part to form walls, very just like, I think it was Moses who divided the waters in the Bible. Just like that, but what happens is a little bit different. So this allows the king and his entire entourage to descend into the seabed, the seafloor. And on the floor, they find that it's riddled with jewels. And so they gather this to finance the king's good works, to fund all of his ventures. And this ensures that the monarch's benevolence is never a burden to his subjects. So this removes the friction of earthly economics from his righteous rule. Notice that this idealized vision, in this vision, there is no open pit mining involved. Because, in the old days, mining must have been an incredibly oppressive labor of shovels and picks. But instead, the scriptures envision a world where wealth is simply discovered. So this is very nice. And we see echoes of this in our own time with countries like Saudi Arabia or Norway or even Texas, where natural resources like oil they gush out of the ground. They kind of explosively erupt, allowing this wealth to accumulate without as much of the grueling labor. So this shows that the ancient texts were not disconnected from the realities of government. They understood that while taxation is a modern necessity, that can just be, that can be just or unjust, a truly ideal state avoids placing that burden on its people. And this brings us back to the choice presented at the birth of the Bodhisattva, or Bodhisatta in Pali. When the 8 wise men examined the infant, 7 of them predicted that he would become either a wheel-turning monarch or a Buddha. So it's fascinating to consider what they meant by Buddha before Buddhism as we know it existed. Because maybe they were probably implying a supreme religious leader versus a supreme political leader. One very wise man, however, insisted that there was only one possible fate, that he would inevitably become a Buddha. So this poses a vital question that even modern seekers should contemplate. Which path does more good? Because a just monarch can redistribute wealth and implement justice for millions in the present moment. Is it truly better to renounce the world than to be politically active in terms of the benefit of others? And from the outside, many see monks as, many lay people even perceive monks as useless. Basically, kind of renunciates and freeloaders to some extent. These are people who they're actually. It's called you renounce the lay life and enter homelessness. So they're essentially homeless people. Some even see them as kind of like leeches. They don't do very much. They ask for food and stuff and resources. But the scriptures offer a definite answer. So even the most idealized world-ruling monarch is not as valuable as a Buddha, because a Buddha's influence persists far longer than any kingdom. Right? Consider history's greatest empires. The Byzantine Empire, which lasted about 1,000 years or so, and yet the Sasana, the Buddha's teaching, it's already 2,500 years old. So in the long run, I mean, the Dharma is everlasting. It's timeless, and it's the only thing that has lasting sustenance. It's a universal, eternal system. So as long as you have somebody to teach that, then this is ultimately probably the best thing to have. The best resource and the best leader. So it's really that you need both. You need leaders to manage the world period by period, but they don't, of course, last forever. So you need the next one who does well, but they all have to follow the basic cosmic principles, the superior principles, which are found in the Dhamma. So we have outlasted the most glorious empires on earth. The story of the Cakkavatti is appreciated because it possesses the absolute optimal political solution to life's miseries, because it asks, is the solution to human suffering political, or is it ultimately or underlyingly spiritual? And so ultimately, even the most perfect political system has its limitation. If it doesn't abide by the laws of the universe, then it cannot, if it's not addressing the root causes of suffering, birth, old age, sickness, and death, that rule of entropy, then politics at best ameliorate conditions within samsara, but it can't transcend it. So while we live in an era trying to solve these issues through technology and social engineering, it's really ultimately ineffective, because the spiritual solution remains the only one that addresses the core condition of existence. And for us, we could say the human condition, but really the condition of life. Now, in the modern era, we attempt to address human suffering through medicine and social policy, but yet aging, illness, and death are ultimately unresolvable on a material level. You can't create immortality with medicine and drugs. You create immortality through sex, right? There are beings who are essentially immortal. The gods are. How do you live to 1,000 years or more, or 1,000,000 years, right? Tens of thousands of years. This is through procreation done in the right level. And when you procreate in the God or at the spiritual level, right, then you can create the soul, solar bodies. And that's, of course, not the way that we usually do it. And it's not through fornication. It's through suprasexuality, tantra. Then you can create life that's more substantial, more lasting. And then those beings at the God level also have to follow the superior rules of nature in order to last, so that they don't decay over time. And we have just arrived at things like euthanasia as to create gentle death for old folks. But it's just an easy way out of a problem that we can't ultimately fix. It's just a really cheap way of remedying the symptoms of, like illness and old age. So political attempts to manage these fundamental human miseries always fall short, and they can even lead to catastrophes like the potential for the overuse of euthanasia. This stands in a lot of contrast to the wheel-turning monarch, whose authority is recognized by other rulers, right? Not through force, but because they are overawed by the presence of the wheel in the sky. And as a naturally righteous person, the monarch doesn't exploit or dispossess these leaders. He simply admonishes them to keep the 5 precepts and allows them to continue as his vassals. So this represents a model of peaceful negotiation based on moral alignment. And historically, Emperor Ashoka of India attempted to emulate this ideal shortly after the Buddha's time. And while he initially conquered the subcontinent with the sword, he eventually turned to the Buddhist, the Buddha Dharma, and used the imagery of the wheel-turning monarch as a form of righteous propaganda. Whereas the classical scriptures describe a Cakkavatti conquering all 4 world islands, Ashoka claimed to be a Cakkavatti of one island, Jambudvipa, which corresponds to geographically, more specifically to the subcontinent of India. I've said that Jambudvipa is the world or the earth, but in terms of scriptures, it sounds more like India because of its triangular shape. But this was the most successful historical attempt to establish that kind of regime on Earth. And many Buddhist rulers have since adopted this motive, or motif, as they say. However, the story of King Mandata serves as a warning about the limits of worldly ambition. So even though he began his career as an archetypal Cakkavatti who conquered all 4 islands of the earth, he remained unsatisfied. He asked his advisors what else remained, and they told him of the realm of the 4 great kings. Then Mandata led his army up the slopes of Mount Sineru, where the guardians, the gods, submitted to his rule. So he reigned there for an immense period. And then again, he became dissatisfied once more. And his advisors then revealed that an even greater place existed at the summit of the mountain, the Tavatimsa heaven. So Mandata climbed the remainder of the mountain and was met by Sakka, the ruler of the gods. And like the earthly king, Sakka was in fact overawed by the celestial wheel. Yet he was too powerful to submit entirely. So instead, he offered to share his kingdom, and the two ruled side by side on the twin thrones. And then, so Mandata's reign in the Tavatimsa heaven lasted an incredible amount of time, an eon, I guess. It's said that he outlived 16 successive Sakkas. And given that a single Sakka lives almost 60 million years, so the math reveals a span of nearly 1 billion years. Yet, despite this unimaginable longevity and power, Mandata grew dissatisfied once more. He began to wonder why he should share his rule at all, thinking, Why don't I just kill him and take over? The moment he harbored that unworthy thought, he lost the protection of the wheel. The wheel sank back to the earth, and Mandata fell with it. And before he died, he explained to those who found him that his fall was the result of insatiable desire. So his story remains the archetype for the nature of sensual and political craving. It is to understand that no matter how much one acquires the unwise aspect of human nature, of endless, ceaseless craving, always that demand for more, what creates always makes things more difficult and more complicated, and puts an end to the success and prosperity. It leads to decay. So we see this same pattern in modern history. In the 1960s, Kennedy announced that America would go to the moon, and yet even that achievement wasn't enough. Now the conversation has shifted to Mars and the conquest of the universe, essentially, the solar system at least. So, and then what? That's probably the limit physically, because you're not really supposed to, if you know anything about space physics, you're not supposed to travel physically. How can you? There must be some metaphysical, non-physical means to travel at light speed or more. Even light speed is still not even close to how fast you need to go to get from to get across the solar system, or at least to travel intergalactically. You need something faster than that. So at that point, we're not even operating in the physical world anymore. It's ridiculous. There's limits to these levels, and yet there's no limit to the human desire, and that's the problem. It's in conflict with the rules of nature. So this insatiable aspiration falls apart at the slightest taint of ego or greed when one is a Cakkavatti. We saw this with Tsar Nicholas II, perhaps the wealthiest person in history, whose empire was quickly overthrown by Marxists. And yet the revolutionaries soon tainted their own cause, and their system lasted only about 70 years. So today, capitalism and Marxism continue to compete for the right to rule the world, each promising a great idea and reacting with shock when it isn't embraced. And when these ideologies encounter resistance, they fall back on the logic that the ends justifies the means. But this is detrimental, because not every mean to the end is righteous or virtuous or follows ahimsa, nonviolence. It is not functional to use violence to obtain the ends. So this inevitably leads to degeneration and violence, with that mindset of by all means necessary. No, that creates karma, right? Can't do bad things to get things. So these stories play out repeatedly because they reflect that deep insight into the human nature of desire, insatiable desire. So noble ideas like those behind the French or Russian revolutions, they frequently end in bloodshed when they attempt to attenuate the human condition through to remedy the human condition through purely political means. And political movements often begin with a noble desire to help people, but they always encounter some problem at the end. This impossibility of ruling without the rod and sword because of the natural underlying impurity of the human heart, in this root race at least. And that impurity has to be addressed. So it also suggests that ultimately the just empire can't be established without the completely fundamental basis of having a pure heart and working with the superior laws of nature, following them, abiding by them. It's the only way to do it. Everything else will create karma and then degeneration. Once that purification actually occurs, you realize the inherent limits of any material arrangement. They have to fall apart. Every system will. So the scriptures illustrate, that's why there's no end. There's no, as I said in the previous lecture, there's no end, completion to any civilization, or at least you don't reach the success or the prominence, the pinnacle of a civilization or a system, or even your own development. You don't reach it at the end and then stay there forever. That's impossible, right? Because you're in existence, you're in samsara, right? You reach the pinnacle of development at some point of maturity, in the middle of evolution. It's at the middle, the maturing stage. And then it will decline at some point. It may last forever, but seemingly, but it will decline. It'll start to decay or degenerate, the system or the organism. So really, that's why the only solution to, if what we want is ultimately happiness, then it's not about making the civilization beautiful and magnificent. It's about everyone obtaining that happiness. That means everyone has to go, right? Everyone has to go and somehow find the way off that wheel. Everything has to stop existing. That's the only way to have what we're really trying to obtain at the end of all this, right? Better just to look for that everlasting happiness, because the kingdoms won't last, the civilizations won't last. It's impossible. So it's ultimately, it's better that everything just ceases entirely, that every person follows the Dhamma and finds their way of walking off the wheel of life. But of course, it's not really possible to do that because there's too much ignorance. The scriptures illustrate this through the story of a succession of wheel-turning monarchs who ruled for many generations. So in this lineage, each elder king would reign for tens of thousands of years before retiring to the forest as an ascetic and passing the throne to his son. And so this cycle continued until one king failed in his specific duties, most notably the duty to provide for the poor. And his neglect led to the emergence of crime and violence, and this caused him to lose the protection of the wheel, and the resulting in the total collapse of the system. So this highlights a very profound Buddhist analysis of government that remains quite pertinent today, because while the Western political thought shifted from the divine right of kings to the social contract theories of Locke and Hobbes, the Buddha explicitly took a practical social contract view of like thousands of years earlier. It was rejecting the Brahmanical idea of a divinely ordained society. The Buddha taught that as human beings degenerated morally from a harmonious state of nature, this is why we begin to lie and steal and stuff. So to address that chaos, the people elect a leader who is righteous. And so an example of this would be Mahasamata, the great elect, to maintain order. And in this framework, government is viewed as a necessary evil required just merely because of human imperfection. There has to be some governments. We can't live in a harmonious commune like in Uttara, whatever it's called. I forgot what it's called, but that blissful commune heaven, if you will. So this particular level of humankind is quite severe in this case of defilements. Not every human race is like this. Ours just requires a lot of governance. We're not fully adults, really. In the eyes of the Buddha, we are not adults. We're still children. We need governance. And when it relies on enforcement and authority, it tends to enter into decline. People eventually arm themselves to circumvent that power, and this leads to continuous conflict. The Buddhist scriptures suggest that the rule of law alone is insufficient to make people good. It's not in our nature to really completely follow the rules like that. So true societal improvement, it's not found in mechanical or political sorting, but in a voluntary commitment to sila, which is virtue. And this has to be naturally cultivated and has to be developed. And you have to evolve into this. And it helps to be a part of a race that has already evolved into this state of naturally perpetuating sila. So when individuals voluntarily choose to cooperate through generosity and kindness and clarity, then life naturally improves. But it takes the will, it takes the willpower and determination. And then when they are merely held in check by authority, it's just a restraint. It's just a guidance, but it doesn't really, it can't do very much because it's not in our nature or our desire or will. We may not want to be good. It's only a matter of time before the system fails. And it would happen much faster than a civilization that, or rather whose species, whose humans have already evolved to a virtuous level. So in their nature, they're less defiled.